That's a very understudied part of the European integration, although has longer-term effects on it. And that's based on a study that we do with several people of mine. This part that is deals with governance in honor of Adrian, actually in honor of or two courses that we taught together, and one of them was actually in very similar topics on governance issues. So this paper, or this presentation is based very much on a paper that I write with Julia Langbein together. So this is the core peripheral relations and regional integration. Now, the language of core peripheral relation is not much in the official European documents. It's under several euphemisms like cohesion countries or pockets of backwardness, or just Central Europe. It's a topic that is there in essence, and lots of the EU documents, actually, for example, those that were written about the integration of Eastern and Central Europe, parts of them could have been written by Prebisch or by Cardoso. They mention problems of inequalities in market integration and potential dangers of that for the accession countries that could have been written in the 60s. Now, what is different from the 60s or the 70s, where the language of dependence was dominant, that is how this kind of integration into bigger markets creates inequalities in the global south. In Europe and in the world of transnational regional integration, we also have interdependence. It means that lots of these problems that are mentioned by the dependency literature spill over to the core. The core cannot externalize, so to say, all these problems and has to deal with that. They might endanger integration, or they might impose costs on core countries, or might diminish the gains. And the EU, and I cannot enter into detail of that, but since basically the accession of the southern peripheries had several programs to deal with this kind of management of core peripheral relations. The most interesting one and the most understudied one is the Central and Eastern European one, and I will talk about that briefly. What are the lessons? So, are there any lessons of the Eastern integration? Of course, if you look at the literature, the mainstream literature, there is not much to learn from that, at least from the perspective of other regions or from the perspective of the post-accession integration, because basically the story what you get is that this was a process of enormous amount of transfer of enormous amount of rules. It's 80,000 pages of rules and policies to these countries, basically within a very short time, successful, implemented already in 10 countries, and then it's underway in other 8 countries. So from the perspective of the other regions, there is no much lesson, because that kind of asymmetric relationship that existed between these countries and the core of Europe or the of EU cannot be reproduced anywhere else. Since after the accession, these countries become equal members of the EU, there is not much lesson. That kind of asymmetrical relationship and hierarchy that allowed for this kind of rule transfer and integration cannot be replicated. So there is not much lesson. But I would like to challenge that, and basically what I say that from the perspective of the core countries, there were 2 problems of the integration. The first problem is how to create a level playing field. That is, how to impose exactly the same rules, exactly the same policies on the new would-be new member state. That they have to play by the same rules. Of course, that means, for example, that just to give you a very simple example, that the Romanian or Polish peasants having one cow had to play by the same, phytosanitary rules than the big combinats in Germany or in Denmark. That was a level playing field. So that was one of the problems, how to impose, how to create the level playing field. The second problem was what to do if they succeed. And that was foreseen already. And if you look at, for example, the Agenda 2000, the strategy paper of the EU in 97, this is full of fears, full of expressed fears. What is going to happen if we succeed, that if we implement all these rules? First, they are not competitive. We will wipe them out. That was one of the fears. The other is that there are enormous costs that they cannot bear. They will not be able to live by that. They don't have the capacity to implement, and they don't have the capacity to benefit from these rules. So these were big problems. So, and moreover, the EU knew that the costs of these kind of problems cannot be externalized. They will spill over, either in the form of economic costs or in the cost of political costs. So there had to be something to be done. So something had to be done. So what were the governance problems of this situation? The biggest problem was that it was very hard to define what should be the goals of the governance, of course, more precise goals of governance, and what should be the right means to do that. So there was no information for that. No one that did that ever before. The Copenhagen Council defined two criteria: capacity to withstand competitive pressure within the EU market and functioning market economy. But there was no agreement whatsoever what these two things are, how to define them and how to operationalize them. The EU never created clear benchmarks on these two things, and never. Actually, we did interviews with Julia, actually in Brussels about that, and it turned out that within the Commission there were some informal benchmarks, but they were never published, and we were not given these benchmarks because these were contested issues. Even within throughout the 90s, the concept of what is a functioning market, changed at least 4 times. So the EU, what it could use is only very broad framework goals and informal benchmarks for that. And the other was that it was no means how to execute these kind of goals in so many very diverse economic and political conditions. That is, the local context dramatically different. There was a multiple context in which so it's not just that the EU didn't have the information what to do, but and what are the local problems, what are the concrete problems. But in many settings, the potential beneficiaries of this information, the local state or local non-state actors, either did not have the capacity to collect this information or generate this information, or even if they had the capacity, they didn't have the incentives to do so, like states that were captured by local rent-seeking groups. So simply, basically, that were the most important governance problems. Then there was a lesser problem that the EU, what were the EU's administrative capacities, that is to govern these kind of issues. So comparatively, just it's very interesting to look at how the EU has, what kind of capacities it has. Size of EU bureaucracy. The overall bureaucracy is 24,000. These are the number of people who are on the payroll of the EU. Now, if you look at, for example, the free market economy of US, how many bureaucrats it has at the federal level? For example, US Department of Trade, 40,000. US Department of Agriculture, 104,000 just on the federal payroll. This is it. Now, if you look at how many people were there for integrating, for dealing with the governance of integration of a new member state, let's say Romania, in the average, 11 full-time members and 30 part-time people were responsible to create a functioning market economy that can withstand the competitive pressure within the enlarged union. So there were some problems for the governance. Okay, so what is the EU did? The EU did a very interesting system of governance that was based on 3 principles. One was it created a system of non-hierarchical joint problem solving, which means that the EU mobilized thousands of state and non-state actors from the old member states and also from the bureaucracy, from think tanks, from NGOs, and sent them. They invaded the accession countries, went to 30 more than 30 different policy fields in the state bureaucracy, and they try to work together with local state and non-state actors to generate the knowledge. Local contextual knowledge, what to do, what are the problems, what are the potential gridlocks, how to solve them. Based on mobilization of this contextualized knowledge. What is that? That in very concrete terms means that local actors were taught how to create EU-conform reporting and planning exercises. So basically, there are three elements of the strategy that the EU did. Nurtures decentered intelligence. What's that? That means that in several of the countries, these EU interventions, these assistance programs and also these twinning programs try to create domestic capacities to generate, collect, aggregate information, create development planning from that, create policies. And also, it tried to reduce the danger of emergence of too narrow local gatekeeping in this process. It is try to impose the inclusion on this country, try to inclusion of non-state actors. While the EU did that, and that's a very important aspect of that, what the EU did is simultaneously try to create domestic capacities or upgrade domestic capacities of generating information, solving locally problems of integration, economic integration. At the same time, it created the supranational capacities. So basically, what the EU created is instead of what is in the literature on this perfected hierarchical governance, that was there. The conditionality was in place, and without the conditionality, actually, this would not have worked. But what it created, it also generated, by the time this process was over, the EU had an infrastructural power to monitor in 10 different countries this process, govern, anticipate and alleviate developmental problems in several policy fields in many different countries of this integration. In a way, if you would like to be brief, the EU invented the Ministry of Economy, the European Ministry of Economy, which basically tried to collect context-specific information about 30 different areas in 10 different countries, policy areas in 10 different countries. Okay, conclusions. I was signaled that I have to get to that. So what is what one can learn from that? What is the message of this from the perspective of European integration? The first thing is that after accession, this kind of mechanism doesn't work. That was discontinued. Basically, the management of core periphery problems, or all these developmental problems that are linked to integrating these countries to the European market are gone. The Europe and the transnational economy of Europe doesn't have a Ministry of Economy, put it very simply. At least as importantly, the EU as a quasi-state basically has a very weak capacity to anticipate and manage developmental disparities. Basically, the EU, the most sophisticated mechanism that the EU has at the moment is the collection of aggregate materials, aggregate data about the economies of these countries at the level of the ECFIN, the DG ECFIN. This is like the early 90s post-economic transformation state in Europe. That is when it still didn't have the intelligence in Eastern Europe. The Eastern European transformation states did not have the capacity to deal with sectors, territories, and other problems of differences. This is the EU, what it has. It deprived itself after the accession or it never created the capacity to anticipate and manage developmental disparities. And finally, the EU as a polity. It's a polity that is based and gathers and centralizes a bigger number of policy making. There's a supranational policy making that is built on national level accountability system, that is in which the key players in Brussels, political players, either in any branches of the EU, don't have an incentive to continuously search for mutually beneficial solutions among countries at different levels of development. Instead of that, they are accountable to national economies, to the core countries and the peripheral countries. So in a way, what the last sentence I would like to say is that upgrading or even improving the management of core periphery relations in Europe is an uphill struggle.